We'll switch to English, and Andrea, the word is yours.
I am trying to switch. Yes, okay. Yeah, I think before we start, it's very important that we also introduce a little bit ourselves. Yeah, so as mentioned, I am Andrea Radu. I'm a director in our cyber practice based in Belgium. Overall, I have about 15 years of experience in information security. And overall, at Deloitte, I'm responsible for what we call cyber strategy transformation and assessments in helping our clients to understand what are their current cyber risks, what should be their strategy in managing the cyber risks that they are facing, how to implement those strategies in the organization, and obviously the topic of today, how to organize themselves and run transformation programs. With that, I will let also Maarten to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So, Maarten Mosmans, 22 years of experience in cyber. So, started my career in '98 with a technical start, I would say, but indeed now more focusing on what we call strategy. And for us, what do we really mean with strategy? It's basically helping our clients to understand cyber risk and to decide on what is good enough, basically. So that's the question we always get. Okay, and there is this whole cyber problem, but what do we need to do? What is good enough? So how much do we need to invest and also how do we need to organize? And that is the topic of today, of course. How do we organize ourselves to deal with this challenge? So I'm happy together with Andrea to share our perspective on how you could approach that. And of course, there's a lot of different aspects that Andrea will start explaining, and then we'll try to make it interactive to get a bit your perspective, your experience as well, in order to indeed conclude with some open discussion on to share our view basically on this topic. So Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Maarten. So I think Maarten mentioned we'll go through a number of areas. Before we dive into the dome of the future, it's important to understand what is a cyber target operating model. What are the current challenges that we are seeing with our clients and in the market? What would be obviously the changes and the things that we need to foresee for the future, and so some overall conclusions and questions from your side. So let's begin with what is the cyber target operating model. Looking at finding some definitions, I think it's quite difficult to find that. However, we came up with our own definition of how we see the cyber target operating model. And one very important aspect is that an organization needs to enable the strategy that is established. More so important for cyber is to manage the risks, the cyber risks that the organization is facing. Therefore, the operating model seeks to enhance the organization's ability to operate within acceptable risk appetite, and also to reduce the exposure to cyber attacks. By building and managing and governing those cyber capabilities that support against those cyber threats and attacks, while involving the right people. And looking also at the picture, what is important to understand is the fact that we see many organizations where cyber has evolved from nothing to something, and therefore they're organized in quite an ad hoc manner and unstructured. And through the definition of a target operating model, that structure comes into place, and you can clearly identify what are the capabilities that the organization needs to have to manage cyber risk. Who are the people that are supporting that organization and operationalize those capabilities? And also, what are the processes and the mechanisms to enable decision-making, investment, and prioritization? Moving on, At Deloitte, we look at the CyberTOM from a 4 high-level components. To start with, we look at what are the enablers that will let us design in the right way. Then obviously we focus on creating that target operating model and designing it. And 2 aspects that are sometimes forgotten is defining those transition plans. So how do you move on from a current state to what you're planning for the future? And during, once you have those transition plans in place, implement it, and also continuously adapt the operating model as, once you design, they're the unknowns that you will find out about once you put things into practice. Regarding the design enablers, it's very important to understand what is the overall vision of the cyber organization. So what is the scope? What are we looking to achieve? And what are the objectives that we would want to get to once that organization is in place? Having that vision in place enables us to have that clear direction and to understand what are we designing towards. On the other side, it's important to look at how how the organization is currently performing. What are the strengths and the weaknesses in the organization? What are the key stakeholders? The specific challenges that would need to be addressed by this target operating model. And then the third point of the design enablers is, of course, we need to set some boundaries. We need to have some principles to avoid any rework during the design. Therefore, we spent quite a bit of time in defining these principles, these guiding principles that to which we would always turn during the design to see what are we putting on paper? Is it in line with the initial thoughts that were considered at the beginning of the exercise? When it comes to the design part, for me, whenever I'm asked about target operating model, there are always 3 main aspects that make an operating model. The first one is indeed the cyber catalog, including some more detail around that related to how those services are interacting and what are the key processes. So we need to understand what are the services and the capabilities that the organization needs to deliver. The second important part is the organizational model. So who are those people that are supporting these services and capabilities? How are these people relating to each other, and what are their roles and responsibilities? And the third important part is the decision-making process, which is enabled by a governance structure.
Maybe one comment to add on that, Andrea, if I may, sorry to interrupt, is this is, of course, a comprehensive model, and it needs to be applied to your particular organization. So we believe that a startup with 10 people that probably doesn't have dedicated security people still need to consider all these different elements. So cyber, in the end, it's a very complex and broad topic, yeah? and you need to look at it comprehensively, but that doesn't mean that you need to spend a lot of time in defining a long vision for a startup, of course, but it is important still to say, okay, what is our ambition level, what is our risk appetite, what do we want to achieve before indeed defining all the other steps. And just to clarify that this exercise, of course, needs to be adapted to the organization at hand.
Agreed. Thank you, Martin, for the addition. Moving forwards, when looking at those design enablers, what are the key questions that we would be asking in each of these stages or during the definition of these components? So we talked about what is a long-term ambition for the cyber organization. Are the objectives that are set by the cyber organization going to enable the business and align with the business objectives? Then related to the current state, we need to look again at those three areas. So what are the teams that are in place? How are they reporting? In which part of the organization are they placed? Is it a scattered landscape? What are the good areas of practice that we can recognize, and any specific challenges and gaps that we can identify, so that towards the design we can make sure that we are covering those gaps. Apologies, my daughter just got into the room and she is looking for something.
Take over for a second?
Yes, please.
Okay. So that's good that we have some redundancy there. So for the design principles, which is the third element of preparing the actual design of your target operating model, we're talking about things like, for instance, the lines of defense. Do you want to consider an internal audit function within the organization if it exists? Do you have risk management? Do we need to build that in to the organizational model later on? So those are a number of things that need to be agreed upon before you start actually designing. So, and then based on that vision, that current state, on where are you and where do you want to go, and the principles, you can basically move to the next step. And I'm not sure if Andrea is behind her screen to go to the next slide. Yes, she is. I don't know if you want to take over again, Andrea, or should I continue?
Yes, you can continue.
Okay, I will. So the three elements there that we had on the pyramid 2 slides ago were then, that's the core of the CyberTOM, basically. It's your service catalog at the one hand, which basically defines what kind of security services you want to develop as an organization. And then we're talking about things like patch management, security monitoring, identity and access management, these kind of things. And so you need to define what are the services that you want to develop, either internally or externally. You can, of course, also outsource some of these services. So that's one thing. So what do you want to achieve? What do you want to build? And then the second step is the organizational model behind that. So who is going to run those services? And again, if it's outsourced, it's probably making sure that the outsourcer is providing those services in the right way. If you're doing it yourselves, then you need to make sure that you have the right people in place, the right competencies, the right skills. I mentioned the lines of defense. Do you want to have a risk management function that oversees what the first line is doing, those kind of things? How many people do we need, and how does it need to evolve, etc. So that's the organizational model part, which basically will then deliver the services. And then, as Andrea mentioned before, the governance is important to make sure that the business has a grip on what is being done. Because as I said before, cyber is a complex and also a very expensive matter. So you need to decide how much do we want to spend, and also report back on why are we spending so much, and is it effective? Are we doing the right things? Are we buying very expensive technology that does nothing? Or do we have very smart people that are doing a great job with little investments? So those kind of things need to be governed, of course, so that the performance and the effectiveness of the controls is under control. So those are the three core components of the CyberTOM. And then the last part of our model, as Andrea explained, is how to put it in place, because it's nice to design something, but to make it work, and that is a change. And change management, as always, is going to be a very important aspect to make sure that your design is actually translated into reality. And that is not an easy thing. So typically change takes time. And again, because of the complexity and the fact that the number of services is going to be high in any case, that is a complex thing. And again, continuous improvement is there. And hence the title of this presentation, the world is changing all the time. The cyber world is changing even faster, and we'll come back to some of those changes later on. So you need to make sure that your operating model is following that change, of course. And so that's, I would say, the theoretical part of this presentation. So that's a lot of information, so I hope that it's clear, but then we can move.
Yes.
And there are questions, of course, to the next part. Andrea?
Then maybe one addition from my side towards the transition part. It's interesting to see that organizations that we are working with, we are defining the target. However, when it comes to implementation, it's never implementing immediately towards the target. The target is always that aspirational place that you want to be, as it's in line with your strategy. And typically strategies are longer term, 2 to 3 years, maybe not so long anymore. So it's important to identify the immediate steps to start changing the organization towards that target. And don't expect that overnight the organization will transform towards that target. Cyber is a very complex domain, and everything is interconnected. Therefore, it's good to understand what are the basics and the immediate changes and restructuring that needs to happen in the organization, and clearly communicate those in the organizations, and then the intention. Let the teams to experience how the new ways of working, and based on that, of course, as Martin mentioned, continuously improve and adjust the operating model based on what is seen in practice. So we talked a lot about what are the specific cyber target operating model challenges. I think before we move on to discussing our views towards those cyber challenges, TOM challenges, we wanted to get your view of what are the ones that you consider that are most important. And for that, I will maybe stop the presentation, and Martin can share a Mentimeter.
So I hope you can see the Mentimeter question. If so, if you can use your mobile maybe to go to menti.com and enter this code, and then you can give some of your perspectives on the challenges that you see or have or had in the past on how to deal with designing and implementing a cyber target operating model. And then we will go to a bit our perspective later on, but it will be interesting to see what you see in this space. Okay, I think those are very relevant indeed. So we'll wait a bit until we see which direction you're going. Budget, yes. I think we have a clear winner. Okay. Good. So maybe just to touch upon a few of these, and then I will move into some of the elements that we are experiencing, and I think most of them are actually coming back there. But the budget one is so central that we can say something on that. We already mentioned that cyber is a complex and expensive matter, and indeed the whole discussion on return on investment and building the business case for cyber is a challenge. And that has been a challenge in the past. It is still a challenge today, and it is a critical component of indeed your target operating model, because in the end we're not building these internal services or capabilities for these services. We're building those in order to help the business to be safe, basically. Yeah? So it's all a matter of risk, and then it's hard to quantify that risk. And it's a very tough discussion, of course, to explain the technicalities and the complexities of cyber attacks to business owners that need to invest a lot of money in there. So it's indeed a major challenge. So the whole strategy where a cyber operating model needs to start from should be indeed based on risk and should take into account the challenge of explaining why and how much to invest in all these different areas. So that is clear. And another big element here is the skills part, and that's again related to the complexity and the change that we are seeing. So it is indeed true to both internally and externally find the right skills to build or not only build, but also to maintain those services. I don't know, Andrea, is there something from your end that
yeah, towards the skills part, I think it's important to talking about how services would be delivered to understand what skills you absolutely need to have in-house and which skills could be outsourced to specific partners or vendors. So indeed, there's a skills shortage that towards the cyber world that everybody is facing. So there it's important to understand what are your internal requirements and what you want to do in-house versus use skill sets that are coming from other specialized organization. Towards, I think one important aspect is the cultural resistance. Indeed, sometimes we see that our customers would want to move towards a new operating model. However, even during the design phase, they still go back to their old ways of working. And to that respect, it's always indeed important to go back to those principles that are defined at the beginning and remind everyone what is the reason why we started this exercise. I think probably in this context, cultural resistance talks also about organizations not yet placing their focus and their understanding when it comes to, they don't have sufficient understanding of what are the cyber risks and don't take this seriously. And you will see probably in the next slides that it's more about having those engagement conversation and not trying to stop things, but more to looking how to support the organization and to find different ways of engaging and making sure that they do embrace, or the business does embrace, new ways of working.
Yeah, indeed. So, and then there's a lot of other, like you said, it's not about stopping things, but enabling the business. That's a balance, freedom versus security, indeed. And it's about awareness, and like you said, not only at the technical level, but also at the business level. So those are all relevant terms. So let's maybe go back to your presentation, Andrea, so you can share the slide with some of the points that we are typically seeing.
Okay. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
You will see that the theme of the three components will keep on appearing in the presentation. So looking at the common challenges related to the service catalog, we talked about the changing threat landscape and the fact that many organizations have started in an ad hoc manner. Therefore, the scope of the security or the cyber services that they are covering is sometimes not complete. Therefore, new services need to come into place. Related to the cultural aspect and to the talent part, it's not always that, in the service catalog, you only have capabilities related to cyber. Obviously, you need to take into account the growth of the talent into the organization, how to set the budget and to manage that, PMO activities related to programs that are going to run. So it's not only about the specific protective or detective and resilient capabilities. Also related to flexibility, or I've seen in the Mentimeter responses, many organizations take the approach of one size fits all, and that doesn't work anymore. So it's probably a while ago, that was, in some cases, this could still work depending on the cyber service that we are talking about or the parts of the business that cyber is supporting. However, that at the moment is proving to be a challenge, looking to have the same levels of cybersecurity across the whole organization. As a next one, and I think this is the most common challenge that we are facing, these services are not fully defined. They are, they're there. However, nobody's really understanding what is the remit of those services, what is the coverage, how are those services going to evolve in the future, etc. Plus, the clear understanding of those the effectiveness of those services. So how well are they, how effective are those controls towards the threat landscape that we are talking? And also, are these services embedded in the business? Moving on to the organizational model, Martin.
Yeah, so if you look at the light blue part, the organizational model, I'll pick out a few points because there's quite a lot of text on this slide, of course, and you can, of course, read them afterwards. And if you have any particular questions, please shoot. But one of the key things there on the organizational part, and so basically how you organize to deliver those services, it's about unclarity on who does what. So if you take the example of identity and access management, there is some technical aspects, of course, to put in place technology to make sure that identities are managed correctly. But in the end, it's a business issue, right? It's about making sure that the business takes ownership of who can access which information and how, and what are indeed the roles and everything. So there it's often unclear who is responsible for what, and that can lead to the business saying, well, it's IT that should handle this, and we suppose that it's okay. And then if there is a problem, of course, it's a blame game. So indeed, clarifying who does what internally, but also towards third parties. If you have an MSSP that monitors your systems for you, it needs to be clear what they are doing, and it needs to also be very clear that in the end, the accountability remains with you as the organization, as the client. So we need to make sure that you know what's being done and what is not being done. And that's also coming back to the effectiveness of the cyber services. A lot of organizations have plenty of technology and providers, but if you test the effectiveness of the services to a red team or whatever, it's often surprising, of course, how easy it is to avoid the controls or to bypass the controls. So that's the accountability, the responsibility. Then there is one of my favorite topics is the lines of defense. And so first line versus second line versus third line. So I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with that, but just the fact that internal audit and third line of defense is probably a common thing that most organizations, even relatively small organizations, have. The second line of defense is not that common. So risk management is probably not available in all organizations, and definitely not for cyber, because cyber is such a technical, complex topic, which is often understood to be within IT. But again, I think it's very important to have some kind of oversight, some kind of independent advice towards the first line, the people that are in the trenches, that are configuring the firewalls, that are managing the security systems and looking into where is our data and is there data leakage, that there is some kind of oversight and reporting to management. And so that's also a key component of your organizational model. And again, in a small organization, it's hard because there's just not enough people to have a lot of lines of defense, but it is important to have those concepts in there somehow, that the owners of the organization don't think they're in a good shape. It's one of these things. So if you as a security professional are asked by a business, are we safe, are we secure? Such a hard question to answer, right? So if you say yes, well, there needs to be a lot in place to guarantee or to underpin that answer. And the second line of defense is basically the role to indeed give some kind of good answer to that question. And so that's the lines of defense, again, within the organizational model. And then we mentioned about the skills on the Mentimeter as well. It's indeed not that easy to make sure that those services are staffed with the right resources. Accountability, we mentioned leadership. Indeed, that's a bit linking back to the budget discussion and are we going to invest in cyber? Or if yes, how much, in which area? So that is also difficult. It's actually quite, it's easy to say our strategy is this, but to operationalize that and to come up with something that is right for the organization. So again, the answer to the question, what is good enough? That is also an important one. So a CISO or a security officer that leads typically the second line of defense, or sometimes a combination of both, needs to be able to lead the organization and say, look, this is what we're going to do. This is something we're not going to do. This is what we're going to outsource, etc., to indeed manage the risk appropriately. So that's the blue part of this slide, and then Andrea, you can conclude with the governance part.
Indeed, yeah, and in support of that of the CISO that is going to lead these conversation, of course, you need to have a structure, an organized structure, and more stakeholders that can support that, and that's what the governance model is all about. Is to bring the right stakeholders at the senior level to support the CISO in taking those difficult decisions. As you can see, related to governance, there's a lack of focus and prioritization, and that's typically because senior stakeholders are not involved necessarily in the decision making at strategic level, and that is still done at operational level. And especially in smaller organizations where resources are scarce, budgets are small, of course, those people are going to be swamped in operational activities and won't have sufficient time to be able to start thinking more from a bigger picture perspective and bringing those more strategic capabilities in place. Even more so, we still see that the cyber performance, so how well is the organization performing and delivering these services and enabling appropriate security controls in the organization. This is not discussed even at any governance body in the organization, let alone defined governance bodies specific for information security. There's a lot of working in silo, so some organizations prefer it's more about either building empires or keeping control over their own areas. And as this is a complex that goes across organization, from a governance perspective, it's important to put all the right places, including the business, in these governance bodies to make sure that informed decisions are taken and those clear priorities and focus is put on what matters. And I think this is obviously not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure there are more challenges and some of related to the budget, etc. What is interesting to see is that with the fourth industrial revolution, emerging technology, etc., these challenges are actually not stopping. They are continuing, and they are even more so amplified by the new technology changes. And that's where we are moving towards the TOM of the future and looking at what has changed and which trends do we need to take into account for the future. So here there are a couple of topics that we would want to talk about, and I've seen also in the Mentimeter that shadow IT appeared, flexibility with innovation. So we're going to touch upon a couple on this topic in a moment. When it comes to digital transformation, we see that there's obviously a lot of move from paper-based to digital, running manual processes, moving towards robotic and intelligent automation. Even now with the COVID-19, obviously, for some organizations, most of operations are happening remotely. Therefore, the attack surface is continuously increasing, and that's not going to stop. So we need to understand what is the organization's asset landscape that requires protecting, and then what are the business needs, which IT and the cyber organization or the CISO needs to support. Yes. Moving towards shadow IT, we are in an era of speed where everything needs to happen at a very high pace. Otherwise, competitors will take advantage and will take a step forwards. So therefore, for the sake of speed to market, businesses sometimes turn to shadow IT or even run their own IT operations to fulfill their needs. So this is again not going to stop and is going to be even more so accentuated. Therefore, it's better to embrace the situation and see how can be managed rather than trying to obstruct it. Of course, we need to set some clear guidelines, but then to reduce that friction and to mitigate the risk, it's important to have that conversation with the business to understand their needs and the specific risks, to define those clear roles and responsibilities, and to give them the right standards and requirements and guidance on when they can take some decisions and what security requirements they need to implement, and when should they turn to the let's say central IT security or cyber operational teams for further advice. Related to innovation, there's a lot of agile ways of working, moving from project-based to product-based, so where there's now continuous change. So there again, needing to speak with those product teams to understand how cyber professionals can be embedded in those teams, and also keep those cyber professionals connected with the central cyber teams. And again, give those clear guidelines on what's possible for them to do on their own and where do they need extra support. Maarten?
Okay. Yeah, so I'll take 3 of these blocks as well. So the yellow orange one on the expanding cyber boundaries. So I assume that's most of you on the call are indeed seeing an increase of third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, so delivering services to you. So if you buy a service, often there is another service provider behind that and another one behind that. So it's actually quite hard to see who is doing what with your information in the end. So managing that third, fourth party risk is becoming more complex, but also more important. And cloud is one example, of course, but there's all kinds of services around there with dependencies. Managing that, getting a view on what the risk is there and whether it's under control is becoming more important. Another one, the dark blue one on technology convergence. I assume again that most of you are seeing that as well, where cyber used to be an IT topic. I think it's more and more becoming a strategic topic because of the importance of information in general. But then there's also OT, so operational technology, or IoT, depends a bit on the industry, how it's called. But there's a lot of technology out there that is also impacted by cyber threats nowadays. But it's actually kind of a different thing. Yeah? So there are similarities, but there's also differences. And what we see in terms of operating model nowadays, that it's often 2 different worlds. So different people, IT is doing the IT side, and then there's operational departments that are looking at the technology. They have different types of risks, where information security is often about confidentiality and integrity and availability to a certain extent, while the OT is mostly about the safety. And so it's kind of a bit different. And often we see that the governance and the people in organizational wise are separate. So we see a trend where those 2 are indeed growing towards each other, but it's still kind of a different world. And it is in fact leading to increased cyber risk because it is governed suboptimally typically. And so that's the technology convergence. And then the green one, I touched upon that when we refer to the lines of defense. So the level of assurance, how sure are you that your cyber risk is managed correctly? And it is a question that you are getting, I assume, from your management, not only because they're investing, but also because the risk is there. If you look at Belgium in the last couple of months, before we went into the lockdown, there were quite a few serious incidents leading to significant losses, so the risk is there, and the question from management on okay, how are we doing and are we sure is a very valid question, and answering that requires more than installing a firewall. So it's indeed making sure that there is assurance that cyber risks are managed. So that is definitely a trend that we're seeing. And then Andrea, do you want to conclude on this? And we'll actually do a voting on this slide to see a bit what you as the audience thinks is most relevant, and whether there are other trends that are relevant for the Tom of the future. So Andrea, do you want to?
Yes, maybe moving on towards the orange box related to the threat actors and increased sophistication. We see that there are more sophisticated or more and more so sophisticated methods that the threat actors are using, and cybercrime has become an industry on its own. It's now a commodity, so you can clearly see prices of phishing toolkits, etc. And I also just read an article that apparently prices for phishing attacks are skyrocketing these days. Obviously, the threat actors don't have the same boundaries and budgetary issues or fiscal years or a specific strategy. They the sky is the limit for them. Therefore, the question is, how can organizations deal with these kind of scenarios? And I think specifically to the situation that we are in at the moment with the COVID-19 lockdown, we see that there are new ways of working. There's even emerging technology. I was seeing on LinkedIn earlier this week that there are people already looking at holding meetings like this one in virtual reality. Therefore, even more so, emerging technology and more innovation is going to come. So we need to stay on top with everything that is changing, and to understand always what are the cyber implications related to the new and emerging technologies that is being developed. And lastly, the black swans. Think about the unthinkable. Nobody, I guess, if you would have asked someone probably last year around the same time, what would happen, that we would all be sitting at home and having these meetings in a virtual way. Nobody would have thought that this is possible. However, it's happening. Organizations and also cyber organizations are suffering, running at lower resources levels. However, the risk is still the same. That hasn't changed. So how can we, as an organization, take these kind of black swan scenarios into account and make sure that whilst these kind of scenarios are happening, the organization is still prepared to respond and to be resilient against cyber attacks. Moving on towards getting also your thoughts on these trends. Martin, do you want to take control?
Yeah, I'm doing that as we speak. So I'm afraid it's a different code this time. So if you can go to, we have two more questions. So the first one is basically you're voting on the little blocks that we just showed you and that we explained to you. Just get a bit your perspective of what you feel are the trends that are most relevant for your cyber target operating model. By the way, if there is any questions or comments, you can indeed always put them in the messages, so we can pick them up there as well. So we're getting in the first answers. Okay, so also there, it is a relatively clear trend, which is actually a good thing for the budget challenge, right? So the business case for cyber is getting easier, I would say, to make. It's still not easy to do everything to mitigate those threats, of course, but it's true that that's also what we've seen at our clients, that there's a lot of concern. CIOs and CEOs talk to each other about these recent incidents and the fact that the threats are real and are resulting in real losses, of course, is driving change. And one of the changes indeed how to organize, and then which services you need, etc. But then indeed also the other topics are mentioned there. Shadow IT was already mentioned, and then the IT OT. Okay, yeah, so black swans, that's always been there for us, but I have to say that that's the thing about black swans, of course, that you don't see them coming. So that's of course the same with the situation. So it's hard to prepare for that. But yeah, so this is the picture. I guess, Andrea, any observations from your end?
I think you touched upon a couple of points already, and also looking at time, I think it's best that we move on, as we still have a bit to cover.
So thanks for this input indeed. So if there's any other trends that you see that are relevant, so it's the same code, so you just should get this question now with a free text. So other trends that you see that you feel are relevant for your target operating model. AI, indeed. Yeah, the competition one is an interesting one. So traditionally, I think most organizations, especially in financial sector, sort of have a gentleman's agreement not to compete on security, because we're all in the same boat, in fact, and it's quite a challenge to deal with this issue. So it's more the idea of sharing against the bad guys almost, because the bad guys are organized. They are indeed, like Andrea mentioned, professionalizing, and it's an industry, and they're sharing the best practices and the tools and the intelligence. So I think it's in our interest to do the same. So it's hard to compete on security. On the other hand, also making the link with privacy and how consumers are looking at organizations. If you take security and privacy seriously and you show that to your clients, I think it is indeed, it can give you a competitive edge somehow. So doing this well. And then a few on internal threats. Yeah, ransomware, APT, and it's a bit related to the threat landscape, and that is indeed the trends that we see. I don't know, Andrea, do you have another?
I think specifically indeed towards the threat vectors that we are seeing is indeed important to analyze the threat landscape for the organization and understand what are the capabilities that are required for the organization to deal with those threat vectors, and more importantly, does the organization have already those capabilities and what further changes need to be done to be at an acceptable level.
Yeah.
I think.
And then the protectionism one is also interesting in the current context, of course, because indeed, we have to see how our global economies and regional economies will evolve. But indeed, there has been some examples, like the technology in Switzerland that was the encryption technology that was owned by, that was basically backdoored towards US and Germany, and small countries against large ones, and China and Russia have an important role in the global cyber landscape. So that is indeed, there's some geopolitical things that might change as well. Hard to make a lot of statements on that, but yeah, so those are all indeed relevant elements that a Cybertom should take into account, I think. So thanks for that. So I'm not sure about US IT suppliers, GAFA. Do you know what that means, Andrea?
No. Maybe we can discuss about that in the question.
Q&A. Yes, so we can put it in the meeting chat. So thanks for this. I guess we should go back to your final slide to conclude, yes. Andrea.
Let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Yeah, looking at the key takeaways. So what are the conclusions? We talked at the beginning around defining the vision and the objectives of the cyber organization. So we need to bring that clarity to the teams that are going to be enabling the cyber strategy and also across the organization. That's obviously based on the understanding of the threat landscape. A target operating model is a system of systems. So it's all interconnected, the service catalog with the organizational structure, with the governance model. If some changes are done in one place, for sure they will have effect in the other components. Therefore, we need to, whenever changes are being made, we need to take into account what will be those ripple effects. On the internal, so the cyber operating model, and not only because cyber is not an island, it's connected and sometimes dependent on IT, is connected with the business. So it's not only about cyber, it's also about what's around the cyber organization. We touched upon the fact that cyber needs to be at the core of the business. So finding ways to how to move up the value chain, and how can the business understand that security considerations need to be taken into account already from the beginning and not an afterthought. Then providing the autonomy for those specific business teams, possibly to take some decisions, but then that to be done in a controlled way. So understand what are the business needs, understand what are the risks, and in which scenarios they can use those standardized ways of working in a secure manner, and in which scenarios new ways of working are required. Going back again to that, to the fact that not one size fits all anymore. Not all parts of the business are requiring the same support. And very importantly is the assurance level. So how and how effective is the organization working, setting up those 3 lines of defense that Martin is very fond of, to enable those right levels of assurance, and to make sure that cyber risks are managed and not only just talked about and reported upon. And it's always about that continuous improvement and being prepared. So on one side, we need to think, but not overthink, because it will change again. So let's take that 80-20 rule. Let's design to what we know now and put it in practice. And based on that, we can then adapt and further improve our model and our ways of working. And then obviously be prepared for the unthinkable situations as reality tells us now that those situations are going to come. With that, I think we can conclude the overall thoughts that we wanted to bring in this presentation, and you can include your questions or speak up your questions if you have any